Welcome in, everybody. Hope everyone is doing well. My name is Jason. I'll be your host on this CFL talk show, Huskies Huddle. In this video, I give my full 2022 CFL season predictions. We're going to go through the regular season, the playoffs, and the main awards that are given out to players this season. And I'm really excited to get into it today. It's one of my favorite videos to record of the year. But really quickly before we get started, if you want to support the channel, as always, be sure to hit like and subscribe. We're so close to 500 subscribers on the channel. Big milestone, and I would appreciate it if you have been watching these videos and haven't subscribed yet, if you can go ahead and do so. And with that said, let's talk about my 2022 CFL season predictions. So this was a really tough endeavor to do this year, just because I think the gap between the best teams in the CFL and the worst teams in the CFL, it's never really been like a smaller gap between those teams. I think, it's really marginal, and you really had to really pick hairs in order to make a final standings prediction. And as I did last year, I actually went through, wrote down the entire schedule, and basically just circled every game so we get realistic records. I'm not going to be like one of those people that says, oh, this team finishes 10-8, this finishes 10-8. And it doesn't make sense mathematically at the end of the day with the standings. So, this is the realistic projection, I think, for the CFL season this year. And, I could be wrong because I could see so many different scenarios happening this year. But this is just the way I see it. And I would love to hear your own predictions down in the comment section. But with that said, let's get into the regular season predictions. We're going to start with the West Division because I find the East Division is actually a lot more interesting this year for once. So starting in the West, we're going to start from going top to bottom here. In first place in the West Division, I still have the Winnipeg Blue Bombers finishing first this year with a 13-5 record. I still think this team is just still in too good shape. They retain too many good players to have a bad season this year. And I think that they're still king in this division, even though they lost guys like Andrew Harris in the backfield, Kenny Lawler in the receiving core. I think, as I explained in my recent roster review, I think they have the ability to overcome that because they have other supporting pieces that they brought in and younger players on the roster that have been waiting to emerge in recent years. So I'm really excited to see what happens with this team this year, but ultimately I still think they finish first in the Western CFL. Now moving on to second in the West, and I think this is where it gets really interesting because I think there's a heated debate between two teams here, and I'm ultimately going to go with the Calgary Stampeders, who I picked to go with an 11-7 record, and this is a team that I am incredibly high on this year, even though I have a lot of doubts about Bo Levi Mitchell in terms of his ability to stay healthy and really recapture the form he's shown earlier in his career. I love Jake Maier. I really am so high on Jake Maier. I think that he could take over this team and potentially take it and run with it and, take this team on a deep playoff run this year. I think he's that good and that poised from what we've seen so far in a small sample size in the CFL. You also have Reggie Bagleton, who's going to be here for a full season. That's going to make a huge difference as a true number one receiver in the CFL. And I think this team just has a lot of talent. Ultimately, this is why I think they're going to be hosting the West semifinal this year. Now moving to third in the West, and this is where I have the Saskatchewan Roughriders finishing with a 10-8 record. And I think Saskatchewan overall, not too much changed with their team over the offseason. I think in general, it's still a very good team, good amount of talent in terms of, the receiving core. Offensive line, I have some questions about, but I think ultimately they found a way to figure that out in recent years. And then on the defensive side, I think there's, a few questions there in the secondary with a lot of young players playing. I think that could be their Achilles heel at times this year. But I think the pass rush with AC Leonard up front, linebacking core is excellent. I think this team is a solid bet to win 10 games again and be a playoff team again in the West Division. Now at fourth place in the West, I actually have the Edmonton Elks finishing with a 6-12 record. And this is the toughest team to predict in all of the CFL this season. Obviously, you got the new head coach, or the new old head coach, Chris Jones, coming back here. And I think it's going to take him a while to really establish the culture here. I do think he's going to get this defense to outperform my ranking of 9th in the entire CFL. But ultimately, there's too many questions about the quarterback to make me think that they're going to be a for sure playoff team this year. Obviously, I think it could happen. Anything can happen in such a small league, but ultimately, I'm not going to bet on that happening, and that's why I have Edmonton at fourth place in the West. Even though I do have more faith in them this year than the BC Lions, who I have finishing fifth with a 5-13 record. And BC, I just don't think they've addressed their core weaknesses this offseason. Once again, it's the same weaknesses that they had dating back to 2019. Offensive line, defensive line. And to their credit, they did bring in Steven Richardson to fill that defensive tackle role in free agency, but unfortunately, that, training injury that he suffered is going to make him miss almost the whole season, or is expected him to miss the whole season. So that's really unfortunate. So they did try to do something there, but the offensive line, they really didn't do anything this offseason to really address it. I did like the pick of Noah Zur in the second round, but that alone is not going to solve everything for this offense. And I think that Nathan Rourke's not going to be the problem here. I think we could see a really solid season, maybe 25 total touchdowns, 15 interceptions, something like that. He looks pretty good, but, obviously the win's not there yet. I think that's the type of season I'm expecting this year from Nathan Rourke, but I think this team just has too many glaring flaws. I think they're going to be in a mismatch basically any week in terms of their line play on either side of the ball. And that's really what's going to doom them this season. Now flipping over to the East Division, which is incredibly interesting this year. I can't think of one year in the CFL, me watching the league, that the East has been as interesting as the West, quite honestly, top to bottom. And I think that's absolutely the case this year. I think you have four really compelling teams that I think could swing either way. And these predictions could be really turned upside down by the end of the season. I think it's that close in the range of outcomes are that wide. So starting with my first place team in the West, the East, and it's going to be the Montreal Alouettes, finishing with an 11-7 record. And this is a team that I think is just poised to have success in the regular season. Last year, I think they really got a raw deal in a couple of games. They should have beat Calgary earlier in the season. That was one they just let slip away. They lost to Ottawa in the regular season finale. And I think there were other games throughout the season where it really could have went their way if they had executed in the red zone and things like that. But this team has a ton of talent. They have superstars on offense. I think they have the most trustworthy offense in the East Division, and I think that's really what's going to carry in the regular season. I think defensively, their defensive line is the strength of that team. I think I had them ranked 4th in my roster review rankings. I think that's just a really solid group. But then my questions with the team really come in the back 8 of the defense. Linebacking core, other than Chris Aki, looks a little bit questionable. And then the defensive back room, I like Greg Reed and Rodney Randall, but I think there's a lot of questions about youth and inexperience and just overall talent there. But ultimately, I think that we could see some guys really emerge in that room and, make this team good enough to finish first place in the East this season. And ultimately, I'm going to trust that they, have success with those superstars that they have on offense and with 2 good quarterbacks that are going to help them make it through this 18-game CFL season. So at first place, I have the Montreal Alouettes, and then at second place, I have the Hamilton Tiger Cats, finishing with a 10-8 record. And this is a little bit of a step back from what they've done in the last couple of seasons. But I do think they still finish with a winning record here, just basically because I think this defense is just going to keep them in a lot of games, and they're going to be able to just win games by not doing a whole lot offensively this year. I think this secondary on the defensive side looks so scary. I think on the defensive line, there's questions about fit, I think, with the 3 interior defensive linemen that they have, but I think ultimately they'll get that figured out and enough production out of those guys. Obviously, Simone Lawrence playing that weak side linebacker position, which is going to be really interesting this year with those hash mark changes. But I think ultimately Simone's a good enough player to, cover that much grass. And I'm really interested to see what happens with this team this year. Obviously, with Dane Evans, his first full season as a starter here. I think that they have enough weapons around him to succeed. I think the big question really is just that offensive line, and if they can, get consistent production from those tackles or consistent play from that left tackle position. And I think those are the big questions with Hamilton going into this year, but I think ultimately they're still good enough to finish second in the East. Now moving to third place in the East, and this is where it gets really interesting. I think that it's going to be so close between these two teams. I actually have them finishing with both 8-10 records, but ultimately I have the Ottawa Red Blacks finishing third place in the East by winning the season series 2-1 over the Toronto Argonauts. And I think with the Ottawa Red Blacks, they're another team that's a huge wild card this season because it's all going to come down to chemistry with this group. Do they gel under head coach Paul LaPolice? Does Jeremiah Masoli really find his footing in a new environment? Jalen Acklin, does he adjust to being a big-time role as a receiver in Ottawa? And I'm really excited to see how this team comes together this season. I think similar to Toronto last year and what I said about them going into the year, and it didn't really end up being true because Toronto actually gelled much quicker than I thought, but I think Ottawa is going to, start out a little bit slow to begin the year, but I think by the end of the year, they'll probably be the best team in this East Division just because I think talent-wise, they're a team that doesn't have a lot of flaws, and I think that's ultimately what football is about a lot of the time. It's not necessarily having the highest end talent, it's about having no really glaring weaknesses, and I don't think this team really has any. And I think that Ottawa, by the end of the year, they're going to be playing good football, and they're going to grab third place in the East. And finally, at fourth place in the East Division, I have the Toronto Argonauts finishing here. And ultimately, for me, it comes down to quarterback. I think that roster-wise, this team probably has the best roster in the East, but I also think they have the worst quarterback and most inconsistent quarterback. And McLeod Bethel-Thompson, first half of last year, I was ready to say I was wrong about him, but then really regressed down the second half of that season. The East Final really struggled to put the ball in the end zone. And I think that that's ultimately what's going to come back to bite this team this year. Again, I could be wrong about this team. I think they have a lot of talent and a lot of high-end talent, especially that receiving core, which is so deep. I think this is the most deep wide receiver core in the league, but I just don't know if McLeod Bethel-Thompson is the quarterback to really take advantage of it. And on a side note here, they just traded away Jamal Peters, a corner that I really liked as a potential boundary shutdown guy for them. So I thought that was, kind of a questionable move. They traded him away to Edmonton, but ultimately, I think Toronto just has a few questions this year, which I think could be their Achilles heel. They're depending on a couple of really older players here in Andrew Harris and Brandon Banks to have big bounce-back seasons after they both had down years last year. So a lot of variables with the Toronto Argonauts going into this year, and that's why I think they're ultimately going to finish last in the East. But again, could be the opposite. Now, before we get into my playoff predictions, let's talk about my CFL Award predictions, starting with Most Outstanding Player. For the nominations in the East Division, I am going with Vernon Adams Jr. of the Montreal Alouettes versus in the West Division, Bo Levi Mitchell of the Calgary Stampeders. And ultimately, I'm going to pick Vernon Adams to win this award. I think he's been knocking at the door for a couple of years now. And if he can stay healthy, I think with those receivers that he has, he's going to put up a lot of big numbers week to week. And I think that ultimately with Montreal finishing first in my predictions, that he's going to be able to capture this award. And then for Most Outstanding Defensive Player, my nominees are in the East Division, Dylan Wynn of the Hamilton Tiger Cats. I think he's going to have a big year, being featured a lot in that defense. And then in the West Division, Willie Jefferson, defensive end from the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. And ultimately, I think Willie Jefferson is going to win this award. I think it's going to be his second Defensive Player of the Year award. And I think he's just the most dynamic defensive player in the league today. He's just kind of just a matchup nightmare for whoever he goes up against. And I think ultimately that's what's going to get him this award. And then the very interesting award of Most Outstanding Canadian in the league this year went back and forth with all the nominees I had for all of these teams. But ultimately, these are the nominees I came with. From the East Division, from the Toronto Argonauts, I'm going with running back Andrew Harris, having a bit of a bounce back year here. And I think ultimately he could be their team MOP as really the engine of that offense. And then in the West Division, such a tough call. I, kind of snubbed Keon Schaefer-Baker out of this, but ultimately I'm going with Jordan Williams, linebacker from the BC Lions, who I think is ultimately going to win this award because he is such a dynamic player, and I think he has the ability to be the best Canadian player in this league. He was already an impact player as a rookie at that middle linebacker position. I think he's going to put up crazy stat lines, 100-plus tackles, 5 sacks, 2 interceptions, something like that this year. And I think with what we've seen in the CFL in recent years, we're starting to see it become a little bit more of a defensive-based award, because I think a lot of the time the Canadian defensive players at linebacker have put up a lot bigger numbers. We've seen the last couple of years Bo Lacombo and Haynock Mwamba win this award. So I think that Jordan Williams is my pick for most outstanding Canadian this year, and I will say that I think he's going to win multiple of these awards in his career. Now moving on to most outstanding offensive lineman, and my nominees here are in the West Division. I'm going with Derek Dennis, tackle from the Calgary Stampeders, who's coming back to the CFL this season after sitting out last year due to a contract dispute with Edmonton. But he's coming back to Calgary where he's really succeeded. He is a former most outstanding offensive lineman back in, I think it was 2017. And I think that he played very well as recently as 2019, and I'm really excited to see what he does in his return to the field this year. I think that when he's at his best, he is one of the best offensive linemen in the entire league, up there with a guy like Stanley Bryant, who I think is the gold standard at this position. But I think fatigue is going to play a little bit of a factor in why Stanley Bryant won't win this award again this year. So I'm going to pick Dennis to win the nomination from the West Division. And then in the East Division, I'm going with guard Brandon Revenberg, who has been the nominee for last year as well, but ultimately lost out to Stanley Bryant. But this time, I actually have Brandon Revenberg winning the most outstanding offensive lineman in the CFL. I think it's only a matter of time before he does so, because he's such a consistent player at that guard position. He has been consistently recognized as the Tiger Cats' best offensive lineman ever since he entered the league. And I think that he is ultimately one of the best players in the entire league, regardless of position. And I'm really excited to see if he actually can win this award this time this year. Now with the award predictions in the books, let's take a look at my playoff predictions, starting with the West Division. In the 2nd versus 3 matchup, we have a rematch of the Calgary Stampeders versus the Saskatchewan Roughriders. Only this time it is going to be in Calgary, and I think the Calgary Stampeders are ultimately going to get revenge in this matchup. Last year, it was a crazy game that really could have went either way. Went to overtime, couple lead changes. I think it was really the game of the CFL season last year. And I think that Saskatchewan, even though they're a very good team, I think Calgary is just a little bit more consistent from an organizational perspective. I think they have a lot of playmakers on offense. Saskatchewan does as well, but I think that I trust Calgary's quarterback position, whether it be Jake Maier or Levi Mitchell playing at this point of the season. I think either of those guys, I think, is going to get it done in this matchup, especially with them being at home, and I think that is why I think they are going to be advancing to play the Winnipeg Blue Bombers in the West Final. Now moving over to the East Division with the 2 versus 3 matchup with the Hamilton Tiger Cats hosting the Ottawa Red Blacks, and I think I compare this to years ago when Hamilton had Casey Printers. They let him go. He goes to BC and then comes back to play them in a playoff game. BC ultimately gets the best of Hamilton. Printers wins that battle. And I think we could see a similar thing here play out with Jeremiah Masoli, who leaves to go to Ottawa this offseason. And I think that Mazzoli, like I said, I think Ottawa's going to take a little bit while to get going this year. But I think once they get rolling at the end of the year, they're going to be a very scary team to play against. I think they have a lot of playmakers on the outside. I think they have a very solid offensive line. I think the Achilles heel with this team could be their pass rush. I don't think they really have a scary pass rush. But I think on the back end of their defense, they're very versatile. And I'm really interested to see how they would do in a matchup here with Hamilton. And ultimately, I do have them pulling the upset here over the Hamilton Tiger Cats to advance to the East Final. I think just they have the playmakers on the outside to potentially win some matchups versus this very good Hamilton Tiger Cats secondary. And I think that ultimately, at this point of the season, Ottawa should be playing better football than Hamilton, and that's why I have them in the East Final. Now moving over to the West Final matchup between the Winnipeg Blue Bombers and the Calgary Stampeders. And I think this is going to be a great season series between these teams this year. And ultimately, I do have the Calgary Stampeders pulling the upset here. And I think it's for no other reasons, but I think it's really tough to stay on top if you're the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Everybody's going to be gunning for you this season. It's a small team league. There's teams that play each other multiple times. And I think that ultimately, I think that their run is going to come to an end here. Even though I could easily see their bid for a three-peat coming true, I just think that Calgary is a team that's going to present a lot of matchup problems for them. And I think that when you look at last year, if Calgary had advanced and the way that Saskatchewan played so well against Winnipeg last year in the West Final and arguably should have won that game with the crazy turnover advantage that they had. I think that they were lucky that they avoided Calgary last year with how they played in the playoffs, and I think that Calgary this time is going to advance to play them and ultimately knock them off to get to the Grey Cup, and I think it's going to be a fantastic game and one of the games of the year, but I think Calgary is going to the Grey Cup. Now moving on to my East final prediction of the Montreal Alouettes versus the Ottawa Redblacks, and I think if Montreal is in this position, there's going to be so much pressure on them to win a playoff game and get to their first Grey Cup since I think it was 2011 when they played Saskatchewan. So much pressure on this team if they're in this position. And then on the other side, I think Ottawa is going to be able to play loose because at this point of the season, say if they beat Hamilton in that playoff game, I think this season is already going to be seen as a rousing success given what they've been able to, or lack thereof of what they've been able to do the last couple of years. And I think that, at this point of the season, like I said about that matchup with Hamilton, I think Ottawa will be the better team at this point of the season. I think they'll be the best team at the end of this season in the East. And I think ultimately I like the way that this receiving core for Ottawa matches up with a pretty poor Montreal secondary. I think that Montreal has a pretty good pass rush, but I think Ottawa has the offensive line that's going to be able to, mitigate that pass rush to allow them to attack this defense down the field and potentially expose it. So I think Ottawa is my prediction to go to the Grey Cup from the East, and I think it's going to be a very exciting playoffs out East. And that sets up a Grey Cup matchup between the Ottawa Redblacks and the Calgary Stampeders. We've seen these two teams play in the Grey Cup a couple of times in the past 10 years, in 2016 and as recently as 2018. And I think in this matchup, I think Calgary, there's a lot of, disappointment about what they've been able to do. I think they've had those two Grey Cups, but I think they feel like they should have won more. Obviously, that 2017 game against Toronto, but that loss in 2016 versus Ottawa, when I think they had their best regular season ever, I think that was incredibly disappointing. I think that this team is going to remember that organizationally, and I think that Calgary, at the end of the day, I think is the better team. I still think the West at the top is stronger than the East, and I think ultimately, I think the Stampeders, regardless if it's Jake Maier or Bo Levi Mitchell at this point in the season, I think either of those guys could potentially get it done for this team and ultimately win the Grey Cup this year for Calgary. But at the end of the day, those are just my season predictions for the 2022 CFL season. Be sure to let me know what yours are down in the comments section. Be sure to hit like and subscribe once again if you want to support the channel. I really appreciate it. And with that said, I hope everyone has a great day, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.